Hello, everyone. I acknowledge the traditional Thank you. Thank you for the reactions. Sorry, I'm not sure what was happening there. All right. So I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather today. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'm joining today's webinar from the Gold Coast campus, which is situated on the lands of the Kumbamarri peoples, which is part of the Yugambeh language region. My name is Nicole Walker, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. I've got a couple of quick housekeeping messages before I introduce our speaker, which we're really excited to have with us here today. So our session today is being recorded, and we will send you a link within a week after today's session. We're also joined by a live captioner. If you'd like to make use of those captions, the link is shared for you in the chat. And please feel free to submit your questions throughout the session, and we will get through as many as we can at the end. So welcome to a new financial year, and our topic today is navigating rising energy costs, which I'm sure is top of mind for many of us. I'm really looking forward to learning more about the energy market here in Australia. Our speaker today is Professor Paul Simshauser. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Iberdrola Australia. He has more than 25 years experience in the energy sector across ASX listed public and private sectors, and spanning a long list of, let me go through them, power generation, energy trading, retail supply, electricity networks, public administration, policy, and academia. His prior roles include CEO of Powerlink Queensland, Director General of Queensland Department of Energy, Executive General Manager of Energy Markets at Infigen Energy, and Chief Economist at AGL Energy. He's also a Professor of Economics here at Griffith University and an Associate at the Energy Policy Research Group for the University of Cambridge. In 2019, he was awarded a Member of the Order of Australia for his significant contribution to the energy industry, both through his executive roles, applied economics, and policy research. Paul is also a Griffith University graduate and an Alumni Award winner. So it's my pleasure to bring him on screen with us today. Hi, Paul. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Nicole. Thanks for the introduction.
You're very welcome.
Can't wait to hear what I have to say.
As for all of us. So I am going to hand the screen completely over to you now, and I will be back later for the Q&A.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to put some slides up on screen, and with a bit of luck, you will all be able to see that. And I can't see you, so I'm going to have to just work on the principle that you've all got this up in front of you. So good afternoon, everybody. I thought what I would do is, in the context of the topic, walk you through what's been going on in the background in the power system, and give you a sense of the dynamics that we're trying to navigate. So what I'm going to talk through quickly is just a bit on investment trends, then some of the cost dynamics. I'm going to do a quick power system planning 101 with you all, then just talk a bit about coal plant and finish off with a piece on the trilemma. So renewables in our market has been slow burn, and on this slide here there's a bunch of information, but the key point to note is that renewables started off under a 20% renewable energy target, or the RET. Apologies for not having that spelt out a bit more clearly. And that really came into effect in the year 2000, and there was a series of investments made under that 20% target, and that was largely satisfied by 2018. Thereafter, it was really capital markets taking over. So if you think about what's been built so far, there's about $100 billion worth of projects. You can see there in the middle of the screen, 274 individual sites, wind, solar, and we'll call clean tech, batteries, and so on. So about 48,000 megawatts of equipment. What was built under that renewable target was the grey line there, from 98 to 2018, about $32 billion worth, 125 projects. And when you deduct one from the other, you can see that was what was substantially delivered just by market forces. And what was really driving that in turn was I guess that drive for net zero. So on this right-hand side axis here, you can see the number of ASX listed companies that signed on to, decarbonise their portfolio. What's the first thing, the average company can do? To be honest, go sign renewable energy deal. It's a quick and easy thing to do, and probably one of the cheapest things that firms could do. And so that was largely responsible for driving a lot of that investment in the late sort of teens through to the early 2020s. At the same time as a bunch of boardrooms were making those investment commitments, we also had mums and dads making kitchen table investments, so to speak. So rooftop solar PV, about 16,000 megawatts is put on rooftops, and that may not mean a lot to you. Maybe the best way to say this is Australia has by far and away the highest take-up rate of rooftop solar PV in the world. It's the one thing that we've done brilliantly compared to all other jurisdictions. In terms of what new capacity looks like over time, we usually start at 1998. That was when our market was first deregulated. And early on in the piece, it was really coal. The last of the coal-fired generation commitments were committed during that period. We then had a period of gas-fired generation. You can see here a big charge in renewables and more recently battery storage. So that's where all the money's gone. And the right-hand side shows you a bit of a description of investment, in particular from 2017 to 2026. Why that period is interesting is that it really describes a dynamic when the marginal cost of renewables started to, at least for a while there, fall below the marginal cost of coal and gas. But more recently, we've started to see a bit of a stalling in renewables. You can see it charging, between 2017 and let's say sort of 24, 25, but there's been a distinct slowdown, and there's I guess a story behind that as well. Just to give you an idea of the wind and solar, that's what's being built, and that horizontal line shows you what we need to be committing to each year to meet the sort of decarbonisation targets that we have set ourselves as a country. So there's a gap that's starting to emerge. It's not because we've got a lack of projects. So that's what's on the ground right now. Coal on the left, wind, solar, batteries, rooftop solar, hydro, and gas turbines. That's what we've got or under construction. This is what we need by the mid-2030s. And here's the sort of the projects that are trying to reach financial close right now. And here are the projects sitting in a pipeline. Don't worry about rooftop solar. There'll be plenty of new rooftop solar. I never worry about that. But what this sort of slide shows you is there are plenty of projects that are capable of making their way into the market. But there's been some cost dynamics that have created problems. So let me just walk you through the time and cost of, and I'm just going to drift into the networks. So if you were transformers, a pretty important piece of equipment. If you want to cut into a transmission grid or the electricity grid with a new project, that's one of the critical pieces of equipment that you'll need to buy. Historically, the lead order time for one of those was sort of between 12, maybe 15 or 16 months in duration. Along came COVID, along came the Russia-Ukraine war and a few other dynamics in the United States. And all of a sudden, if you were trying to buy a utility spec transformer, you were talking sort of the better part of 4 years. And that was huge amounts of demand and supply of electrical equipment manufacturing not keeping up. From a cost perspective, on the right-hand side axis, you can see this little dot over here. In 2017, we would typically buy a transformer for $3.5, maybe $4 million. If they went up at the price of inflation, be up around about 31%. This is what's actually happened. So there's been a pretty much a trebling in cost. There's sort of 11. In fact, this year you'd be sort of somewhere between 11 and $12 million in 2026. The lead order times have shrunk back a little bit, but certainly the cost has not. It's a similar story for wind. So if you were thinking about doing a wind project in 2018 with 2018 costs of equipment and 2018 capital markets, interest rates and expected returns, you'd need about $58 per megawatt hour, the unit of measure. In 2019, it got better until it didn't. And you can see here by 2025 that the numbers have more than doubled. So how do we get from a very low price in 2019 of 48 to a price of 110 in 2025? Well, first of all, we've been in a pretty high inflation environment over the last handful of years. We've also had a very, very substantial rise in interest rates, or conversely, we had extremely low interest rates in 2009. They were the official cash rate at that time was sort of sub 1%. You'll probably all recall. The manufacturers are, the cost of their equipment has gone up. Transmission connection and balance of plant rounds it out, and there's your 110. So when you sort of stare at this, it's really all about inflation, interest rates, and equipment costs collectively conspiring. Solar's been a bit of a better story. A lot of that comes down to, just constant innovation in the productivity of panels and the productivity of installation at projects. And of course, for batteries, it's been time and scale has led to just a sort of an ongoing reduction in the cost of observed projects in our market, both in terms of their cost and also their size. They're getting much bigger. So we've had this environment where battery investments have surged very significantly. They've been cheap. Wind and solar has started to stall, and that raises that question: are we on the right path? In order to do that, I guess the starting point is there some better way, and we can actually sort of stare at this pretty carefully and model what the market would look like, and model a counterfactual scenario. Should we have give up on renewables given the prices and gone down some alternate path of reversion back to coal or chart a path with natural gas? So I'll just walk you through how we would assess that. And so let's go all the way back to 2005, and we're going to use Queensland data here, and we'll calibrate our power system model. In 2005, if you were thinking about the cheapest technologies, they were coal for baseload duties, open cycle gas turbines. These are just like a very simple gas engine and fired off natural gas, very cheap to build. And a combined cycle plant is sort of somewhere in between. It's a gas turbine with a steam turbine attached, a bit more capital, but a lot more efficient. So what you can see there is the fixed costs in dollars per megawatt hour of running those plants. And then on the fuel costs are given by the grey bars. And you can see all of a sudden that the overall cost flips. So coal is the cheapest and the open cycle plant's the most expensive. But they've got that nice rich blend of fixed and variable costs, and we can use the combination of those three technologies to get the right overall power system reliability and system costs and prices. And by throwing it into a particular modelling framework, we can work out exactly what the system average cost and the baseload spot price would be. And the process is this. There's the model. Now you're all looking at thinking, what on earth is that? What I'm going to do is break this down and walk you through how this model is actually constructed. So first of all, we're going to zero in on that top chart, then we'll move to the bottom chart. So the top chart, we're just going to expand it out now. So you can see on the y-axis, the vertical axis, we measure the costs of power stations in dollars per kilowatt per annum. And on the bottom axis, we've got annual runtime. So there's 8,760 hours in a year. So if a power station was running at 100%, it would be very much a baseload machine, of course. And something running at 5% would be a peaking plant. So if we think about those three technologies, the open cycle gas turbine, the peaking plant, the intercept here shows you the fixed and sunk costs. That's the annual cost of maintaining the plant without turning it on. So you've got interest, you've got equity returns, you've got labour and materials and so on. The slope of that line is the marginal running cost, so the cost of the fuel that you would use. If you think about a combined cycle plant, it costs a bit more to build, but it's much more efficient in its use of fuel. And then, of course, you've got the baseload coal plant, extremely capital intensive, hundreds of people on site, but an incredibly cheap fuel source. You can see that depending on the run time at the bottom here, there is a natural sort of efficiency of moving between technologies. So if you're going to run flat out, very high level of utilization, sort of 65 to 100%, the coal plant is your best option. If you're going to use something up to 35%, so maybe a couple of nights a week, or throughout hot summer and cold winter nights, the open cycle gas turbine is the cheapest. You won't build a coal plant just to do those sort of peaking duties. And similarly, if you have something running, say, 5 days a week during the day but turning off overnight, the combined cycle plant would be the right poison. And that's how we clinically define what's called baseload power or baseload duties, peaking duties, and then intermediate in between. So we can actually quantify quite accurately what those duties look like. Now we're going to move these down to the second chart, and we're going to switch the y-axis. You'll remember this is all about dollars. We're going to change it to megawatts, but we're going to keep a common x-axis, so time exceeded. So let's go down onto that next slide. So now we're talking megawatts, and what this line here is a low duration curve. It's every single 30-minute electricity demand for the year of 2005, and I can tell you this point up here would have been the very highest point, a little over 8,000 megawatts. That will have been at around about 12:30 on the hottest day of January or February, and that would have been a working weekday, the highest point of electricity consumption. This bottom point here, by the way, would be Christmas morning at 4 a.m. That's the point at which economic activity and anthropogenic activity hits its absolute nadir every year. And these are all 30-minute points ranked in descending order accordingly. Now, what I've done is transpose those crossover points from the previous chart onto this megawatt slide, and all of a sudden you can, and we're still using the same x-axis. You can start to see how much baseload coal, how much intermediate combined cycle plant, and how much peaking gas turbine plants we need. So with that, there you go. There's our model. By throwing our numbers into a big calculator, we can work out that our system average cost is about $47 and the base load price would be about 40. The difference between that cost and price, think of the system, you've got a very peaky periods throughout each day. A base load is a continuous stream. So there's always a little bit of a difference. And as it turns out, they were indeed the costs and prices that existed in 2005. So what's happened since 2005? Well, first of all, let's have a look at coal prices. So there's our 2005 cost. That's what coal power stations would have been buying coal for back in that period. And you can see here coal prices have gone up by pretty much a factor of 8. In our analysis, I'm going to assume a 50% discount. Long story, but you'll just have to humour me on this. Assume we find a coal miner who's stranded. With gas prices, we typically buy around $3 per gigajoule on that axis there. You can see what's happened to the gas price over time. It is similarly up by, there's the export price. We started exporting LNG out of Gladstone. You can see the numbers up about 300% in the forward markets. So if you were thinking about what the cost of our machines were back in 2005, a coal plant was 37 on its own, a combined cycle plant about 45 on its own. Our open cycle plant, the carrying cost, so the cost of the reserve capacity about $9.90, and on the rare occasion that we did need to turn it on, you can see the overall cost about 60. If we escalate those 2005 costs through to 2025, that's what we would expect to see in today's dollars. Yet this is what we believe the cost of building those machines would be in today's market, because of the combination of coal being much more expensive, gas being much more expensive than as a commodity than just rising at the price of CPI, and the cost of building these assets has also gone up, particularly for coal. Not so much for gas, they've been sort of almost a sort of sideways drift, but certainly for coal plant a big increase. So if you're standing at the menu of options to build new plant in the current environment, you can see where solar and wind is sort of where people have gravitated to. You do need to firm them up; they are intermittent, but when you sort of tack on the carrying costs of these various technologies, you can see that on average, a combination of wind, solar, an open cycle gas turbine, or a peaking plant, 4-hour battery, and a pumped hydro is going to outperform the old way, and that is indeed when we think about it. There's our 2005 model. Remember our $47 cost and the $40 baseload price. If we escalated it, that's what it would look like today. You'd expect 88 as the system cost. If we were trying to rebuild the system with coal, it'd be about 150. Similarly with gas, and the trajectory we're on is around about $100 a megawatt hour power system. Here's the key thing. Is renewables cheaper? It is cheaper than the alternative, but it is more expensive than the old world we came from in an escalated way. It's a little bit like saying, what's the cheapest thing we can do from a car perspective? Is it to continue to run our 1980s Ford Falcon with petrol and insurance and registration, or is it to buy a brand new electric vehicle for, pick a number, $35,000, $40,000? Clearly, it's a lot cheaper to keep running our old power station or our old Falcon. But eventually, though, that Falcon will come to the end of its useful life, and at that point, we need to replace it with something else. And these are our options. And right now, renewables and those firming assets are still what our industry believes is the cheapest way to go. The problem is it is now more expensive than our old fleet, and that's a very tricky narrative for politicians to try and navigate. Just for good measure there's our forward prices, and you can see they're roughly calibrating at that $100 a megawatt hour model. All right, so this all suggests that we're on the right path with replacing our aging coal plant with wind and solar and all the various firming capacities. Can we keep kicking coal plants their closure dates down the road? Look, I guess if we go back to our Ford Falcon scenario, what's your best option? Is it to keep putting fuel in with a bit of registration and insurance? Look, it probably is if it's you and you know that if it breaks down, you can jump in an Uber. I'll just give you a thought experiment now. Now imagine it's our fleet of ambulances. How do you feel that we ought to maintain that fleet going forward? And that's the way we need to think about with a power system. Power is actually the backbone of the entire economy. When you take power away, and I've seen that in various communities, sort of following cyclone events and so on, our society doesn't operate very well at all. Everything from water supply, sewage, ATM, transactions all go off. Society basically breaks down. So we do need to be constantly thinking about reliability of supply. So here's the thing about the coal plants. That's the scheduled closure of our coal fleet on the east coast of Australia as at 2022. And you can see the vertical green line there shows you where we're up to. 7,000 megawatts of coal generators have gone. A number were due to come off over the next few years, but they have been delayed. And they've been delayed for good reason. The supply side is not quite ready yet. But there is a limit to which we'll do that. This chart here shows you the retired coal generators by their age. And this is the remaining fleet. And you can see just the weighted average of coal plants. 44 years was the average retirement age of those that have gone. 39 years is the average age of those that are in service right now. So just by that alone gives you a sense that there is some level of maybe not urgency, but we need to be consistently moving with new projects into the market over time. And by their size, those that have gone and those that are remaining, when the new ones leave, they're much bigger. So we've got much more to replace. And another way of thinking about coal-fired power stations is their engineering design life. So, when we were designing and building these things in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they had an engineering design life of 200,000 operating hours, or about 30 years. And you can see on that bottom axis there, that's quarters on commissioning. When we would develop these or buy these projects in mergers and acquisitions, we'd usually put 50 years in the spreadsheet, and you'll see there's a little acronym IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone, was the sort of the joke. Unfortunately for me, I've some of those M&As that I was involved with, R&D approaching their 50-year life, so I'm getting to see this writ large. And what I thought I'd show you here is there's the benchmark outage rate of coal-fired power stations, and here's the actual outage rate of every single unit on the east coast of Australia. And you can see that curved line there. As they get older, they start breaking down more often. They start becoming a lot more unpredictable and a lot more costly to maintain. And if you think about it, putting that average outage rate into 10-year blocks, it really is when they're in their 40s that the outage rates really become challenging for grid stability. Also, with their age, they're also facing a much more tougher life in the market. Over the years, just on that left-hand side axis is the price of a rooftop solar PV. They've come down enormously in cost over time. And on the right-hand side axis is the average size that Queenslanders are installing on their rooftops. That means we've got more and more solar coming into the market. It's not just Queensland, it's right across the East Coast, almost 25,000 megawatts of rooftop solar PV. What significance does that have to coal-fired generators? Well, it means that we're getting more and more very low and frequently negative prices during the middle of the day, which is sending a bit of a closure signal to inflexible coal plant, their baseload plant. They can't just turn on and off quickly. So they have to ride through, these very low price events. And if you think about, that's what average daily load looks like in the month of September. You can see over the years what it's looked like. There's the baseload market. As those rooftop solar PV installations got bigger and bigger and the take-up rates higher and higher, you can start to see a very clear duck curve emerge in the electricity market. So in other words, the actual baseload market is shrinking. There's a physical market dynamic that's happening here. Now, batteries will start to offset that and drive that in the other direction, but rooftop seems to be accumulating much faster than our storage has. So what are all the policy implications of all of this? Well, coal plant closures, when they are happening, they're happening for very good reasons. Can I emphasise? If coal plants are being extended, it's because the market needs them to stay in, on the grounds of security of supply or risk of price shocks or both. One of the issues of delaying them, though, it does create a bit of a circular problem. Now, if you delay a coal closure decision and a bunch of projects have been making their way in the market, add supply and extend supply, clearly that's going to have an adverse impact on price, which creates this circular problem for other renewables pausing before they invest. Historically, the most successful policy in our market was the renewable energy target and the large-scale generation certificates, the LGCs, that we use to drive that investment. It's probably going to be too hard to reinvigorate that policy. One obvious candidate is to start creating strategic reserves or a waiting room of gas turbines to try and break the cycle of delayed exit. Let me just finish off on energy policy and the trilemma, or the quadlemma as it probably needs to be. I'm sure most of you would be familiar with this trilemma. It's that tension that power systems have all over the world between trying to balance affordability with security and decarbonisation. There is this little sweet spot in the middle, but we so rarely get there. I think if you think about our market and policy movements over the last 20 odd years, we started off with the national electricity market reforms in the 1990s, that classic Hawke-Keating reform era, I guess, fingerprints, and then obviously implemented in the Howard government period. But it was about affordability. From there, we had our 2% renewable energy target. We had blackouts in both Sydney and Melbourne, which caused a huge increase in network capital to try and stiffen or harden up the grids to various shocks. From there, we had the Kevin 07 election, and we were told the greatest moral challenge, and so the renewable energy target got increased to 20%. Rooftop solar PV feed-in tariffs came in, and we finally had a carbon price passed in 2011. That was axed in 2014 with the Abbott government, and at the same time, the Australian Energy Regulator started tightening regulatory allowances on networks in terms of their capital, systematically eliminating 30% of the spend in their allowances. From there, we had a black system event in South Australia. Alan Finkel did his review to try and draw us back towards the centre, and then we had the exit of the Hazelwood Power Station, which was unexpected and sent prices through the roof. We had the renewable energy super cycle from 2018 to 2021. That was when renewables were cheaper than all forms unambiguously, and that's where our politicians got that narrative around renewables will be cheaper. We were then told at COP26 we're moving too slow. We then had the jobs plan, energy plan in 2022, which drew us back into the middle. We had the Russia-Ukraine war, which created an energy crisis in 2022. The capacity investment scheme was brought in 23 to try and accelerate renewables once again. We had obviously the outworkings of the global supply chain shocks in 23, 24. And of course, now we're having issues with social license, numbers of projects all over the countryside, and we're starting to see the impacts of that on communities. And right now, coal plant extensions is probably the thing that's exercising the minds of planners and investors the most. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I am done. Nicole, back to you for
Awesome.
questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. That was really interesting, and I had never heard of YBG. So that is a new one to add. Now we've got a few questions coming through, and I'll just, sorry, I got to scroll down to the bottom. All right, so our first one is, can you tell us more about Iberdrola?
So Iberdrola is the world's second largest listed utility, headquartered in Madrid in Spain. Very big businesses in Spain, in Great Britain, United States, and in Brazil. Has a bunch of other countries wrapped up in a group called Iberdrola Energia International, and Australia is one of about 8 or 9 countries in that group. So here in Australia, we have a portfolio of wind, solar, batteries, and gas turbines, and we're just starting to do a little bit in electricity networks as well. So that's our background. We're headquartered in Sydney, with offices in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and plants dotted all around Australia.
Thank you. And how has AI impacted the industry, both from the obvious increased demand for energy, but also from planning, strategy, and problem-solving energy issues?
Look, I think the most prominent impact of AI is actually staring at us rather than hitting us right now. But there's data centers, obviously an investment du jour. They are very, very energy intensive. Most of the proposals for data centers are actually in Sydney and Melbourne. They're not so prominent in Queensland, at least not yet anyway. That's largely driven by sort of latency considerations, as I understand. I don't profess to be an expert in data centers, but that will certainly turbocharge the demand side of the industry if even 10 or 15% of the proposed data centers were to materialize, and usually with a hype boom, as we see like this in our sector, you can expect 10 to 20% of things to happen, and the rest don't bank on until you see the whites of the eyes and some signatures, so to speak. From an industry perspective, AI is probably having more of and probably a very beneficial impact on the retailing side of our industry. Lots of aspects which are capable of being, increased in efficiency, so to speak. Similarly, across maintenance, predictive planning, and so on, obviously lots of opportunity there. And I've got a team here trading floor who quite like putting our AI and its variations to good use in some of our forecasting and modelling and so on.
Awesome, thank you. What are the natural advantages Australia has for managing our energy supply compared to other countries, and what are the main disadvantages?
The disadvantage is distance. That's always been a bit of for a country like Australia, distance is always an issue on the transport side. So linear infrastructure suffers a little bit from distance wise. Conversely, we've obviously got a very big land mass, and that can sort of, at least in theory, make things a lot easier. Historically, where Australia's had great advantages, there's been very low cost coal, very low cost gas, and from a renewables perspective, we've got areas with world-class wind speeds and certainly world-class solar. They're not always close to where we consume electricity, and that sort of therein lies the perennial challenge in our sector. What we have done brilliantly as a nation over the last 10 years has been rooftop solar. That's the thing where I think when you stand back and look at all markets across the world, when people are staring at markets and they're trying to pick out what's done really well in Australia, they'll say rooftop. The other thing that we have increasingly done or doing very well, although I sort of fear a bit of irrational exuberance on the investor side, but is utility scale batteries, and no doubt household battery take-up rates given the current policy settings. So they've been little known fact, but Australia has the third largest utility scale battery market in the world, not adjusted for size. If you do it on a per capita basis, we're number one, but with a bullet.
Okay, Didn't know that. You mentioned in the presentation the most successful government policy to date. The next question is, what might the next most successful government policy be?
Look, it's a good question. There's two options that I think will get kicked around. One is the safeguard mechanism currently applies to industrial emissions, but not to the electricity industry. And if you drifted it into the electricity industry on a phased or graduated basis, I think it's got the capability to sort of move the needle in terms of predictability, policy certainty, and investment. The other interesting one I think will be how data centers are and navigate the environment that they're in. I mean, if they are very big loads and they do turn up, and that on the one hand, a data center load connecting to the power system is wonderful for the transport charges. They will utilize idle capacity, and their high capacity factor or very continuous runtime should in theory mean that network prices for households and businesses become a little bit cheaper as a result. The more of them you put on, the cheaper power prices will be. The reason for that is that networks, the network part of our industry, so I'm talking about the transmission towers and the distribution poles and wires outside of your house, they are on a downward sloping cost. So the more you use them, the cheaper they become for everyone. Flip side is on the electron side, so the manufacturing side, think of it as the making of the power at site. It's an upward sloping curve. So when you bring in a data center, the network and transport charges become cheaper, but the commodity cost of producing power will increase in price. So one way of trying to navigate that from a policymaker perspective is for data centers, a notion of bring your own power with you. In other words, you bring wind and solar and batteries and whatever else you think you need to supply your own data center needs. Well, that won't be a terribly efficient way of doing things. We've got better ways of doing that through markets and exchange and trading in certificates and so on. And so I think that from a policy perspective, and this is a live issue with energy ministers in all the states and the Commonwealth right now, they're going to need to think through, what is the policy if we really get a run of data centers coming into the market to make sure that we don't end up with sort of structural shortages on the supply side, and sort of a BYO power over time, maybe not the first 5 or so years, but beyond that, and using certificates will be a good way to get there. And that could be a derivative of those old renewable energy certificates from the old renewable energy target.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was a long answer.
That's okay.
For the propeller heads, they'll have understood it. For everyone else, if you didn't understand it, don't worry.
The next question is, how do you work with traditional landowners for Iberdrola's projects?
So first thing, I guess, is in any of the areas we're in, we do our level best to think carefully about economic benefit and employment and so on. So if it's network related, we're sort of still trailblazing there a bit. So we haven't got a settled position yet, but I can talk on my former life, and that would inevitably involve agreements with local traditional owners for access. With employment, I'll just give a really simple example. The most recent power project we did was about 2 hours north of Rockhampton, a place called Broadsound. It was a project involving a 300 odd megawatt solar farm and a 180 megawatt battery. Workforce there, about 120 people, and almost half of those were First Nations people. So trying to make sure we really go hard on employment, that's always a good start.
Thank you. The energy market is long-term, complex, big money. How does that conflict against short-term politician terms?
Yeah, not well. Is the short answer. And I think if you think about that last slide that I put up with the pinging around, you've got politicians responding to an issue du jour, and by the way, that's our political system, and that's policy making here in most democracies. So and it is difficult for industry to navigate at times. But when you look through that prism of the trilemma or the quadlemma, those policy movements, as an industry, we're sophisticated, we should be able to anticipate some of those movements. And what I mean by that is, if we see power prices rising, we should anticipate a political response. Why should we anticipate a response? Because it's an essential service, and because households will be injured by high power prices. No government can sit by and then an electricity market injure our vulnerable households and do nothing. They need to respond accordingly. And the industry, whether they like it or not, needs to use a technical term, suck that up and try and manage the market better themselves. So there's a little bit of self-help there. Where it can become tricky for the industry is the chopping and changing on the overall directional goal. And what I mean by that is the politics of climate change. In our country and a handful of others, it's very tricky because you've got different political parties with quite different policy positions, and that can sometimes make investing degree of difficulty 9.5.
Yeah. Thank you. What do you think the impact of electric vehicle storage will be on transmission infrastructure?
Well, hopefully positive. And I guess our latest forecast from the central agency, the Australian Energy Market Operator, has certainly pointed towards that, not so much with EVs themselves, but with storage more generally, as it becomes more cheaper and more accessible, both at utility scale and household level, whether that's a home battery or a two-way EV. So in theory, if you've got more storage, you'll need less transmission. And the extent of that in the most recent change out from the forecasts 12, 18 months ago to the forecast today, I had a sense it was it was almost 12 or 15% reduction in the required transmission. That's a good thing, right? Because transmission's expensive. We don't want any more of it than we need.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, thanks, Paul, great presentation. Just wondering where nuclear roughly sits in relation to the generation cost figures you showed.
Look, it's an interesting one. We don't really have any experience here in Australia to draw on, so we're always only ever guessing. And the other thing too is with first of a kind never goes well in any country. Even if it's a bit mature, you're still having to ramp up a group of people who've never done it before. But my sense has always been, the last set of numbers I saw, it was sort of 300 a megawatt hour plus was the most recent number I saw. I haven't done any due diligence on that number, but it was it sort of was put to me by a pretty credible group, so it felt really expensive. If you did it brilliantly, you can probably do it for less than half of that, but it sort of feels very difficult. At the same time, I've been loath to. I'm not a supporter of nuclear, but I'm not a critic of it either. I just sort of consider it a technology option that will evolve over time and one day could be very interesting for us. So I don't think now's the time to be getting excited about nuclear, but I'm sort of loath to sort of throw rocks at it as a future option, because what I can tell you about a power system is at the moment you might recall on that slide we had the old coal the coal machines, so sort of we've got about 20,000 megawatts left. We started out with closer to 30, so 7,000 has left the market, and we've got to keep moving them out of the way over time as they age. When you get to the last 5,000 megawatts of coal, power system models really struggle to hold it all together. There's a real benefit in having sort of a big baseload generator, like front row forward in a rugby pitch or something like that. There is a role for everyone. So if we have got all our coal fleet out of the way, there is something we're going to need that can produce a lot of energy. And the reason for that is we do go through these periods of the Germans call it a Dunkelflaut, so still and dark. when it's still and dark, you've got no wind, no solar, and the other things that are currently on the renewables path of producing all our energy. Now we can store those in batteries and pumped hydro, but only for really most of our storage is the hours to days at most. And I can tell you there are periods there where you'll go for 3 or 4 weeks with extremely low energy balances that sort of are a fraction of what we need to keep the lights on in our homes and businesses on the east coast of Australia.
Thank you. There's lots of discussion in the media about the impacts of connecting wind to the grid, the cost of cables and impact to farmers. Do you have any insights to the discussion?
Yes, I do. So look, the reality is that when you're building, sort of transmission infrastructure to, a remote wind farm site, you're traversing across, typical wind farm might need somewhere between 20 and 70 kilometres of transmission lines, so to connect back to the main transmission backbone. So by definition, it's going to traverse a few properties, and not everyone's thrilled about having transmission towers, crossing their borders. The industry has got a lot better at navigating that. So payments to landowners, being really thoughtful about where you actually run a transmission line. There are good places and bad places to run a transmission line, and actually thinking about whether the community is actually up for it in the first place. For the farmers who actually host a wind farm, they get a lot of money. They get a lot of money every year. There's a lot of money in hosting a wind farm. Transmission line, there are sort of a series of annual payments or an upfront payment depending on what that is. So that's been sort of like part of the benefit. And then I guess the other thing I suppose that the industry's slowly got better at is thinking about what else they bring to the community. So for example, when you're building a transmission line, the very top wires are it's called OPGW, so they're earth wire, but they've got fibre optics in them, and about every 5 kilometres there's a break in that fibre optic cable. You put a receiver station in there and basically provide unbelievably quick broadband to an area that may have none whatsoever. Other examples, of course, is when you're rolling into an alignment or an area, making sure that you go in early and start to think about how you procure as much as is humanly possible from local communities. I know in my former life, before we would go along a transmission alignment, we'd send a team in 6 months ahead, going and meeting with all of the chambers of commerce, on all the towns along the way, explain to them, that all these organisations are coming in. Here's what you need to do with your insurances or whatever it is, so that you can supply everything from, we used to say, snake bite kits through to lunches, through to sort of engineering and fabrication services, or even sort of putting local council assets that are otherwise idle to good use, batching plants for cement and so on. So there's ways of sort of actually creating a lot of economic activity. And then there's the simple things that we can and should do, such as make sure we put some solar PV panels on the local sports clubs or the local sort of community buildings, and restoring sort of dilapidated mobile phone towers and so on, or strengthening them, given that we'll be bringing a lot of people in. So there's lots of little things that the industry can do that really help the gross regional product of an area that would otherwise see nothing. So there's and what the industry needs to make sure they do a lot better of is reminding everybody that yes, there is an impact. We clog up roads for a bit and so on, and that can be pretty frustrating. And we've got to look after the roads to make sure we leave them in at least as good a state as we found them, if not better. But we've got to do a much better job at coordinating and making and reminding communities that there's a lot of economic activity that goes with it, and it's economic activity that won't otherwise happen.
Thank you. What do you think about solar share scheme and the role of demand side incentives or management in the energy system?
Yeah, the solar share scheme, it's a curious one. My my intuition was for something like that, I would rather see it quite targeted and for vulnerable households. Sort of don't like the idea of someone in Ascot getting a scheme that's designed to be sort of really, sort of and of course the solar share scheme in its own way, it would be interesting to see how the prices all thrash out. But I like seeing sort of schemes like that targeted carefully. And the reason we should be ambitious about targeting schemes is because we have the best tax and transfer system in the world. Very few people know this, but Australia is better at identifying vulnerable households than any other country on the planet, and we're better at taking money off the wealthy than any other country on the planet because we're really good at targeting. Now, it's not perfect, but it's the best in the world in terms of its accuracy. Now, the political rub becomes both sides of politics love that we've got that accuracy, and then the tussle becomes over how hard you pull the levers. Where both sides are in united agreement is we really should be looking after the most vulnerable in society. And so when I see a scheme like that, I sort of think that's where it should have been targeted and also limited to. And we've got great welfare flags. Electricity retailers know exactly who those people are. Quite often, they rent in a home, so they're never going to have a rooftop solar PV. Not while or at least they don't have control over whether they get one. Secondly, they probably couldn't afford one even if they do have the ability or the bandwidth to do it. The average vulnerable household is not, a pensioner. And my mum hates it when I tell this story. She's a dear old thing she is. I don't worry about my mum. She's sort of, she's a Burma. She's, so she's sort of, has always been a bit cash strapped, but she lives in a big house. So mum, sell your house and downsize, then you won't have that problem, So the households we need to worry about, the face of vulnerable households is a 44, the absolute pinnacle of it is a 44-year-old parent, mum, dad, maybe both, with a couple of kids, with the biggest either mortgage or biggest rental bill I'll ever had, and a couple of uncontrollable consumers. That's the kids who are they're the biggest consumers. I know most people would think that the wealthier you are, the more electricity you consume. It's just not correct. The facts are there is no correlation between income and electricity consumption. And when you used to do this a lot in my AGL energy days, dive into the enormous amounts of data we had with 3.5 million households on our book, household accounts on our book back in the day. Our biggest consumers were actually all vulnerable, as a class, were the vulnerable households.
Thank you. That was very
long
insightful
answer to a simple question.
That's right. What does an average week look like for you?
So for me, average week, 3 days down here in Sydney, a couple of days up in our Brisbane office, punctuated by sort of Melbourne or site visits if I need to. Monday and Tuesdays are pretty long days with sort of calls over to Spain sort of into the evening. The rest of the week's usually not too bad. And then racing through all of the various parts of the business, whether it's O&M of the fleet or trading decisions, trading policies for in the forward markets. These days, a lot on network planning, and dealing with the consortium members that we're in, and oodles of HR issues.
What are the main skills or expertise that are hardest to find when recruiting staff?
That's a good question. I think it sort of depends in the segment of the organisation you're looking at. I mean, we have it's a pretty broad. In the electricity industry needs most professions inside it at some place. I mean, if you rack and stack all the various qualifications inside a place like Iberdrola or Powerlink when I was there, or AGL. I mean, it's just almost endless. From the health professions all the way through to sort of the high tech engineering and so on. But I guess the rarest hen's teeth in our sort of line of work is really the grid planning, grid interface people. So that's sort of electrical engineers with a black belt in sort of very real time systems integration, and making sure that when we connect something, we don't break the whole grid. That's a pretty rare skill in our sector.
What's the main takeaway you would like future leaders to understand about Australia's energy market?
Look, the main takeaway for us is it has as an industry, it exists to serve and pure and simple. We're here to serve the public. Yes, it's commoditized, and yes, most of the players in it these days are in the private sector, but we first and foremost exist to serve the Australian people and Australian businesses. And so we need to be ever mindful of what the North Star is as an industry. Keep the lights on, keep the prices down, and we've got to do all things necessary to make sure we sort of, I guess, over the last at least 15, 20 years, start to work the emissions out of the system as well. You don't need to believe in climate science. You need to believe there's a risk that it might be right. If you believe there's a risk it might be right, then think of it as what you do with your house. Do you take out home insurance or not? So I mean, they're the three things that we're always trying to balance, and I guess these days fourth with the quad lemma, and it's a pretty helpful diagram to think about what we're trying to manage and what we've got to stay focused on as leaders in the sector. Never lose sight. That's what it's all about.
Awesome, thank you. It's probably all we've got time for today. There's a few more questions. Thank you everyone for your participation in the Q&A. A great range of questions that we were able to cover there. Just got a couple of messages before we close. So we've got our next webinar will be on the 6th of August, and that will be focusing around why good work isn't enough anymore. And so it's a career-focused session looking at, in an AI-focused world, what skills are still relevant, how to build a sustainable career without burnout, and what does executive sort of leadership and leadership skills, what's most important at the moment. So I hope you can join us for that. We've also got Griffith University Open Days coming up soon. If you or your children, friend, neighbour are interested in studying, or you want to come back and have a look at campuses. So Gold Coast and Brisbane South campuses will be open on Sunday, the 9th of August. And then we're also very shortly about to open registrations for our 2026 Lead with Impact program. It's titled Leading All this year, and it's a 3-part series running across late August and early September, focused on developing others, managing teams effectively, and what it takes to go from good to great as a leader. So registration for that session will open very soon, and we hope you can join us for that. To close today's session, we've got a video celebrating some of the research projects that helped take Griffith to the #1 spot in Australia and the top 2 universities in the world in the 2026 Times Higher Education Sustainability Impact Rankings. So really excited to share that video with you. And thank you very much, Paul, for your time today. Really appreciate it, and learnt so much, and lots there for us to think about as we go forward in our careers. So I'm just waiting. The video is probably here somewhere. I just can't see to click to it. So, oh yeah, here we go.
At Griffith University, we believe the world can and should everyone. In 1975, our teaching and research have been focused on addressing the most important social and environmental issues of our time. Consistently ranked in the top 250 universities globally, Griffith makes a significant contribution in Australia and internationally by linking research excellence with real-world needs. Above all, our research is concerned with humanity. We collaborate closely with industry to address today's most significant socio-cultural issues, including climate action, domestic violence prevention, and disability and rehabilitation. Social and environmental responsibility are at the heart of the Griffith difference. To save our planet, to make it safer, to make it more accessible. When we break new ground, it's for everyone's benefit. In areas from advanced manufacturing and artificial intelligence to clean energy, conservation, healthcare, and beyond, our researchers work to create lasting, meaningful and transformative change for individuals, families, communities and all of society. A brighter future for all.